In the cold silence of Sector Theta 9, where stars blink like distant tears in an eternal night, the Varlin ship drifted in agony. Its hull was fractured like ancient bone, its atmosphere leaking in shivering breaths, and the only surviving officer, a pale, slender being named Keth, Shell pressed trembling limbs against the reinforced glass of the viewing chamber. He stared at the small blue world rotating below, a primitive-looking marble cloaked in clouds, its beauty irrelevant to him, its threat vast beyond comprehension. Kethshul had been warned about the humans. Every Varlin cadet knew the story of the warships built in caves of ice, the fire-wielders who smiled during battle, the primates who sang songs as they destroyed fleets, whose rage was only matched by their strange tenderness. The Varlin called them the Broken Ones, not because they were weak, but because something in them could shatter and still stand taller than before. Kethshul had never believed the stories until now. He had seen what they did on Saria. Prime, how they burned their own weapons to save enemy children, how they wept over bodies that were not their own species. They did not fight for dominance like the Rithari, nor for ideology like the Koran. They fought because they felt. They bled because they chose to stand, even when their leaders ordered retreat. Now, with his ship crippled and his distress beacon answered by a single vessel of Terran make, Kershal waited with a kind of dread he had never known. The docking clamps hissed, lights flickered. Gravity failed, returned, failed again. Then, footsteps slow, deliberate echoed through the ruined corridors, like the knock of fate itself. The Varlin had feared this moment. They had thought it would come with fire and war songs. But when the human finally stepped into view, silhouetted by the hallway light, Kethshul saw no weapon in his hand. Just a thick jacket, a battered helmet tucked under one arm, and eyes that held galaxies of sorrow and fire. He was not tall. He was not armored. He was not smiling, and yet Kethshul fell back as if before a god. The human said nothing at first, just surveyed the wounded ship with a gaze like a scalpel, sharp and clean. Then, gently, he asked a question that shook Kethshul deeper than any weapon ever could. Are you alone? No accusation. No demand. Just a question wrapped in something almost like grief. Kethshul, voice cracking under his species' unique hum, replied, Yes, we didn't mean to trespass. We didn't know. His words died, swallowed by guilt. The human tilted his head slightly, reading more in Kethshul's body language than words could say. Then he knelt, not as conqueror, but as caretaker, reaching into his backpack and pulling out something wrapped in foil and warm food. Not just protein, but kindness, unfamiliar and terrible in its weight. And as Kethshul took it with shaking hands, he understood why the galaxy feared humans, not for their weapons, not for their fire, but for this unbearable mercy. Ship groaned around them like a dying beast, the air thick with the scent of melting cables and scorched metal. But the human moved through the wreckage as if he were walking across sacred ground. He didn't speak much, not at first. His name was Elijah. He said it without pride, almost like it was a burden he carried, not a badge. Kethshul watched him with wary fascination, limbs tucked close, bioluminescent veins flickering dimly. In fear, this creature, this human, had every reason to hate him. Kethshul's species had fought the Terran Union more times than history could hold. Their fleets had left colonies in ashes, traded hostages, even broadcast threats through pirated frequencies. Elijah had likely lost someone to the Varlin, maybe a sibling, maybe a city. Yet here he was, sealing atmospheric breaches with practiced grace, sharing his rations, even offering a faint, tired smile when Kethshul accidentally called him Terran Destroyer. That made Elijah laugh just once, a dry, rasping sound. From a throat tired of making noise. Destroyer? He repeated, brushing dust off a control panel with callous fingers. I used to be, maybe not anymore. He never explained what changed him, but it lingered in the way he moved. Careful, reverent, as if every broken thing around him mattered, as if every system was a person he was trying to save. Kethshul, born to a species that taught dominance through precision and war, couldn't understand it. Why fix what you could leave behind? Why help the enemy, especially when the war never truly ended? But Elijah didn't see him as an enemy, and that was the first thing that broke Kethshul's logic. You're hurt, Elijah said at one point, gesturing to a tear in the Varlin's side membrane. Let me look. Kethshul recoiled at first, more from shame than pain. In Varlin culture, wounds were private, a mark of failure or dishonor. Showing one to another was a kind of surrender. Elijah must have known, or maybe he didn't care, because he didn't wait for permission. He just stepped close, warm hands, outstretched, and used a small device that hissed and clicked against alien tissue. not painful. Just gentle, purposeful. You shouldn't be alone out here, Elijah muttered, more to himself than to Kethshel, as he applied a regenerative gel. No one should die like this, not in silence. And those words landed like meteors in Kethshel's chest, because it wasn't just about the wound anymore. It was about the universe they both floated in, massive and uncaring, and how one act of quiet kindness could feel louder than all the cannons ever fired. They worked together for hours, repairing what they could, salvaging energy cells, rerouting navigation to the escape shuttle. Kethshel found himself speaking more than he ever had. Not about war or orders or protocol, but about fear. About the loneliness of command. About the time he ordered a strike and watched smoke swallow a city, only to learn children had been inside. Elijah didn't judge. He didn't flinch. He listened. And sometimes that hurt more than any accusation dot, as night cycle fell and the ship dimmed into quiet stasis. Kethshel found himself drifting toward the observation window, where Elijah sat staring at Earth. Is it beautiful? The Varlin asked, voice low and uncertain. Elijah didn't answer right away. His eyes were far away, lost in something beyond stars. Then he said, "It is, but not because it's perfect. Because it survived." Kethshel didn't understand the full depth of those words until later, but he nodded anyway, touched by something too large to name. And in that moment under the faint light of a broken starship, a strange, tentative thing began to grow between them. Not trust, not yet, but the seed of it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For Kethshel, who had been raised on stories of Terran fury, it was unsettling to see such restraint in Elijah's every breath. As if this human had turned rage into sorrow, and then forged that sorrow into compassion sharp enough to cut through hate. Kethshel was used to binary choices, war, peace, friend, or enemy. But Elijah lived in the in-between, that strange place where enemies shared rations and past crimes were met with silence instead of vengeance. The fear that once clouded Kethshel's mind began to lift, replaced by something far more dangerous. Hope. And he wasn't ready for it. Not yet. Not with the secrets he carried. Not with the storm still hiding in the far side of the galaxy. But for now, in this quiet moment aboard a dying vessel, it was easier to pretend that two strangers could look out the same window and see something worth saving. The days blurred aboard the drifting wreck, the stars outside creeping past like watchful spirits as Elijah and Kethshel existed in a kind of liminal space between escape and isolation, between fear and a fragile companionship neither dared name. What began as mere survival gradually turned into something heavier, deeper, like the thick gravity around dying stars. At first, their conversations were sparse, scattered through the metallic corridors with the stiffness of enemies pretending civility. But the more time passed, the more their silences grew meaningful, shared not out of tension but understanding. It was not just the repairs that brought them closer, but the way they filled the quiet with their stories, broken pieces of history offered like fragile gifts across species lines. Kethshel spoke of his hatchmate Refin, who had vanished in the Scorn ambush, how he had been the better pilot, more curious, less afraid of aliens. Elijah responded with a tale of his own about a woman named June, a scientist who had laughed with her whole body and cried like thunder. She had died on Jericho Station when the Varlin plasma rounds carved through its hull. He didn't say it with blame, and Kethshel didn't flinch when he heard it. Instead, they both sat in the flickering glow of the emergency lights, staring into the same painful distance. That was the strangest part. Not the war, not the species gap, not even the strange similarities in their grief, but the silence that followed, soft and sacred as if they both knew words couldn't fix what had been lost. They mourned in parallel, and it bound them like metal melted in the same fire. Once, in the dim warmth of the auxiliary bay, Kethshel asked Elijah why he hadn't reported him. The human could have turned him in, activated the beacon, alerted the patrol ships. Elijah had paused, tools in his hands, brow furrowed in a way that made him look much older. "Because vengeance doesn't fix grief," he had answered simply. "And I've had enough of watching people die to make the universe slightly more balanced." Kethshel didn't understand that immediately. His people believed in correction through action, restitution through dominance. But Elijah's version of strength was different. It was quieter. It didn't roar, but endured. It didn't conquer, it carried. Elijah carried more than his silence. He carried guilt, heavy as the oxygen tanks strapped to his back. Kethshel could see it in the way he touched every part of the ship, as if tending to the bones of the dead. Sometimes he caught Elijah whispering under his breath while soldering wires or rebooting systems. Not curses, but names. Names he never explained. Kethshel didn't ask. He knew what names meant. Names were gravestones you kept alive in your chest. But one night cycle, with the stars spinning above them and the earth pulsing below like a distant heartbeat, Elijah asked a question that froze the Varlin's veins. Do you think your people can change? The words hit harder than any accusation. Kethshel wanted to say yes. He wanted to speak about reform councils and interspecies talks and the new generation of hatchlings, raised with Terran philosophy injected into their learning modules. But the truth, bare and sharp, choked in his throat. I don't know, he said at last, but I can. Elijah nodded as if that answer was enough, and maybe, in that moment, it was. Because in the grand scale of the cosmos, maybe change didn't start with nations or fleets. Maybe it began in the wreckage of a dying ship, between two broken souls who found they could still believe in something greater than survival. Later, when Elijah let Kethshel hold one of his memory drives, a device containing images, voices, fragments of his past, the Varlin understood the true shape of human pain. There were recordings of children laughing, a dog barking in a park, rain falling on a rooftop. None of it strategic, none of it useful in war, but all of it precious. Kethshel had nothing like it. His memories were stored in logic spheres and data matrices, all sterile and practical. And yet when he listened to the voice of a child, yelling, "Come home, Uncle Eli," through the crackle of static, something inside him shifted. A longing, sharp and sudden, bloomed inside a heart that had never known such things dawn in return. Kethshel offered his own keepsake, a folded piece of biopaper encoded with pheromonal script. Varlin art almost impossible for humans to perceive. But Elijah pressed it to his nose, closed his eyes, and said, "Smells like lightning." It made Kethshel laugh, his bioluminescence pulsing in surprise. No human had ever made him laugh before. It felt like shedding armor dot, and so, without ceremony, without grand speeches or oaths, a bond formed. Not alliance, not diplomacy, but something more ancient. The kind of connection forged not in war rooms, but in shared wounds. The kind that could someday, if nurtured, reshape galaxies. Asterisk, it began with a tremor in the walls, a flicker in the lights. Too irregular to be part of the ship's failing systems. Elijah noticed it first, a soft hum in the floor plates beneath his boots, like a second heartbeat thrumming through metal. He rose from where he'd been recharging a power core, his expression sharpening into something Kethshel had not yet seen in full, alertness without panic, the practiced stillness of a man who had spent years preparing for moments just like this. "That's not normal," he said quietly, almost to himself, as he glanced around the corridor. The hum grew louder, pulsing in waves, and then the ship's rudimentary sensor panel lit up with sudden red glyphs, alien and urgent. Kethshel moved to the console with haste, claws dancing over the interface, trying to translate the failing language matrix into something Elijah could follow. "It's a ping," he finally said. "External, a proximity scan." He paused, military grade. Elijah's jaw tensed. "Yours?" Kethshel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The human could read the answer in the way Kethshel's shoulders sank, in the way his luminous skin dulled like a creature retreating into darkness. "It's not a rescue signal," the Varlin said finally. "It's a hunter signal, a probe." He looked up, face shadowed by something close to shame. "They're not coming to save me, Elijah. They're coming to erase me." The silence that followed was absolute. In it, Kethshel explained what he had not dared share before, not out of deception, but because he hadn't been ready. He had defected. Not officially, not with any dramatic declaration or stolen intelligence. He had simply stopped believing. After Syria Prime, after seeing the children his ship's bombardment had left buried in dust, he had begun sending reports with false coordinates, sabotaging targeting systems, smuggling out civilians to neutral zones. Someone noticed, and when he was reassigned to a diplomatic escort mission and sent into deep space, he realized it wasn't a promotion, it was a death sentence. His ship had been quietly sabotaged. The damage that left him adrift wasn't from an enemy ambush, but from his own people, pre-programmed into the flight core. They never meant for him to reach Terran space. They meant for him to vanish before anyone could ask why. Elijah listened without interrupting. He leaned against the bulkhead, arms folded, a shadow over his face. When Kethshel finished, his voice cracking with something dangerously close to grief, Elijah nodded once, slowly. "So that's why they're pinging. They know you're alive, and they want to finish what they started." Kethshel looked at him with naked anguish. "They'll destroy the whole ship, even you, just to make sure I'm gone. They fear what I know, not what I've done, what I've seen." His words trembled. "They fear that I've changed." For a long moment, Elijah said nothing. Then he turned and walked down the corridor, slow and thoughtful. Kethshel followed, uncertain. When they reached the observation deck, Earth hung still and blue in the window, beautiful and out of reach. "You know what I think?" Elijah said finally, eyes on the planet. "I think they do fear you. But not just for what you've seen. They fear that we talked. That we might understand each other." His voice dropped, rough with emotion. "Because if one of you and one of me can stop seeing enemies and start seeing people, then all their damn wars fall apart." It wasn't just rhetoric. Elijah meant it. And Kethshel felt the weight of that truth settle into his bones like gravity. They were two beings alone in a damaged ship, surrounded by the silent cold of space, but somehow they represented a threat greater than any fleet, a possibility. A crack in the endless armor of hate. The next tremor was stronger. The sensor alarm wailed. Elijah snapped to action, pulling up the ship's limited comms array, rerouting power from systems they didn't need. "We have maybe 12 hours before that probe sends a full report," he said. "And once the Varlin get that signal, they'll send a destroyer. No questions, just a clean burn." Kethshel moved beside him, his breath short. "Then we have 12 hours to disappear." But it wasn't just escape they were planning now. Elijah had an idea, a terrible, brilliant idea born of war and hope and the kind of reckless courage that only humans seem to carry like instinct. "We'll make them think we're dead." A reactor surge, a fake distress call cut short, "Body's yours and mine recorded in the logs. And then we vanish in the shuttle. They'll write us off. And in that quiet, we can build something they can't trace." Keshel's voice caught. "But if they find out, they'll kill you, Elijah. You'd be labeled a traitor to your species." Elijah looked at him then, a quiet fire in his eyes. "Maybe, or maybe they'll see what I saw. That you're worth saving. That this," he gestured between them, "is worth more than orders." It was reckless. It was dangerous, asterisk. And it was exactly the kind of impossible plan that could only be born from the belief that the future might be different than the past. In that moment, Kethshel finally understood what made humanity terrifying. It wasn't just their weapons, or their will. It was that they looked into the face of fear and chose to believe anyway. In him, in change. In mercy. Asterisk, the hours crawled with dreadful precision. Each tick of the damaged ship's chronometer thudding like a countdown to oblivion. Outside, the stars glittered in their silent judgment, but inside, the air grew thick with urgency. The Varlin probe continued its scan, invisible to the naked eye, but heavy in its presence. Its signal like a sharp needle threading death into every corner of the ship. Kethshel moved with uncharacteristic speed now, stripping components from the navigation panel, rigging explosives that hummed softly with volatile promise. Elijah guided him, his hands dirty with coolant, sweat tracing slow lines down his dust-smeared face, but his voice remained steady. "We're going to trick them, not fight them. They want death. We'll give them death, our deaths. And when they turn away satisfied, we slip through the cracks." It would have been easier to run, simpler to abandon the wreck, erase all evidence, and vanish across the stars. But Elijah wouldn't do it. Not without leaving a message. He insisted on constructing a data core, a black box of sorts, one that would survive the ship's staged self-destruction. Not for the Varlin, no, they'd never listen, but for anyone else who might find it. A record of what happened here. A record of one alien who chose conscience over command, and one human who answered not with fire but with mercy. "Even if we die," Elijah murmured as he encoded the final audio file, "someone has to know. Someone has to remember we tried." But it wasn't just courage that made the plan fragile. It was trust. Kethshel had never truly placed his life in another's hands, not like this. His species didn't allow it. Vulnerability was weakness. Weakness meant demotion, dishonor, exile. And yet here he was, handing over his identity tags, his internal link codes, everything that made him traceable. So Elijah could erase them completely from the escape shuttle's database. "You'll be a ghost when we launch," Elijah warned. No name, no past, just air and silence. Kethshel met his gaze with unflinching eyes. That's better than being a weapon. But even as they moved toward escape, a new complication began to bloom in the background. Elijah had a tremor in his right hand when he tried to hide, but Kethshel noticed. It wasn't from exhaustion. It was something deeper, more permanent. "You're L," Kethshel said one cycle later as they calibrated the shuttles. "Trajectory." Elijah tried to deflect. Old injury, nothing important, but Kethshel had studied Terran biology during wartime. He saw the way Elijah coughed, the blood hidden in cloth. Radiation sickness, likely from one of the early campaigns. Slow, irreversible, terminal. You won't survive long after this, Kethshel said quietly. Not as an accusation, but as a grief blooming too soon. Elijah just shrugged. Didn't plan to. Been dying a long time. This is something I want to finish before I go. Kethshel's bioluminescence dimmed to a mournful blue. Why help me? Why not spend your final days on Earth? With your family, your people? Elijah looked out the viewport at the stars, face unreadable. Because they already know me. They already understand. Your people don't. And if one of you remembers me when I'm gone, then maybe this wasn't all for nothing. Those words hurt more than any plasma wound. Elijah wasn't saving himself. He was saving the idea of change. Not just for humans, but for those the galaxy had labeled too far gone. For those born on the wrong side of a war. And the stakes were no longer just survival, they were legacy, redemption. The shuttle would only hold one comfortably. 2 would make the oxygen last. Hours, not days. Elijah had known that from the start. Kethshel realized it too late. No, he said suddenly, voice firm. We both go, or neither. Elijah smiled, tired and kind. You're stronger. You'll make it farther. You'll tell the story better. He placed a hand on Kethshel's shoulder, rough and steady. Don't waste time grieving me before I'm gone. Just promise you'll remember, not me but this. What we did. But Kethshel couldn't accept that, not easily. Not with everything Elijah had given him trust. Laughter, belief, it wasn't just duty now. It was something more sacred. A bond that demanded more than escape. And in the quiet that followed, he began adjusting the environmental controls of the shuttle, rerouting filtration lines, dividing oxygen flow. It would be tighter, harder, that they might both survive, even if it hurt. Elijah noticed, but said nothing, only gave him a look filled with both protest and quiet awe as the final countdown approached. They loaded the ship's command AI with falsified logs, played out their final message, staged their deaths with chilling precision. The explosives were set to trigger the core's overload and vaporize most of the evidence. All that would remain was a drifting black box, 2 fake deaths, and a planet below that would never know how close it had come to being a battleground once again. And as they sat side by side in the cramped escape shuttle, strapped in engines, primed for launch, Kethshel looked at Elijah not as an alien, not as a soldier, but as something infinitely rarer, a friend. Asterisk, the countdown echoed like a slow drumbeat through the bones of the ruined ship, and with every pulse, the air inside. The escape shuttle seemed to thicken. Elijah sat in the pilot's seat, pale beneath the glow of the dashboard, his eyes fixed on the decaying systems overhead. Kethshel knelt beside the rear console, monitoring the faked core readings, ensuring the ruse would appear genuine when the Varlin probe received the data burst. Everything had to be perfect. One wrong heat signature, one misaligned broadcast frequency, and the deception would collapse. And with it, so would they. But the confrontation didn't come with blasters. Or brute force. It arrived in the moment between ignition and escape, when the final data transmission locked into place, and the ship's eye, connected briefly to the central Varlin comnet, blinked alive with a voice Elijah had never heard before. Cold, precise. Female, but alien enough to ring like crystal shards scraping metal. Directive Override 144B initiated. Varlin trader confirmed. Target, Elijah Roan. Terran War criminal designation. Contact class Omega. Kethshel froze. Elijah didn't flinch, but his jaw clenched hard enough to creak. The probe had accessed the Varlin command mat. And somehow, somewhere, Elijah's name had surfaced. Not just as a man, as a threat. His actions during the siege of Arion Theta had been redacted, even buried, but someone remembered. Someone had fed that past into the machine, and now the probe wasn't just scanning for a missing pilot. It was scanning for a human ghost it had orders to destroy. Kethshel's hand moved to the console, but before he could wipe the signal, the probe system struck back, jamming their shuttle's thrusters, locking the launch bay in a magnetic field. They were trapped, suspended in the mouth of a dead ship, with the ghost of Elijah's past closing around them like a steel coffin. Elijah stood, not panicked, resigned. They won't just bomb the ship now, he said softly. They'll send a drone fleet, rip everything apart. They think I'm a catalyst. Kethshel turned toward him, alarm blooming through every nerve. You said the file was buried. It was. Elijah's voice was tight, but I should have known. The Varlin ArchiveNet doesn't forget. Especially not the monsters. They helped make. Then came the worst part. The AI pinged again, this time with a translated Varlin message. Surrender the human. You may live. It wasn't a bluff. They would destroy the shuttle if both remained, but Kethshil had a choice. And the A, I knew it. Elijah looked at him, calm even now. Do it, he said. Eject me. Let the shuttle launch with just you on board. They'll believe it. You'll live. His voice, steady and full of that maddening, sacred human mercy, tore through Kethshil like fire through dry leaves. I won't, Kethshil hissed, trembling. I won't betray you. You gave me everything. I gave you a chance, Elijah said, and his voice cracked for the first time. Don't waste it on me. But Kethshil had already moved past that line. He stepped between Elijah and the shuttle controls, hands raised, not in threat, but in defiance. If I abandon you, then nothing we've done means anything. Then I'm still one of them. Still afraid, still ruled by orders and fear. His bioluminescent skin glowed gold now, the color of resolve. Let them come, let them see, we won't hide. The magnetic field clung to the hull. The reactor overcharge timer ticked ever closer. Elijah stared at Kethshil, and for a long, suffocating moment, said nothing. Then at last he nodded, slowly. All right, together then. They turned back to the console in unison. Not as a soldier and his captive, but as two rebels standing at the edge of a storm, with their fingers flying over switches and touch panels. They rewired the magnetic field generator, turning the field signature into a mimic of a core implosion signature. It was risky. It could backfire. But if it worked, the probe would detect an explosion too dangerous to approach and retreat, triggering its failsafe, automated self-destruct to cover traces. One lie to silence another. As the field flickered and the shuttle systems blinked. Back to life, Kethshil whispered, they'll still come looking for us. Elijah gave him a tired smile. Let them. They'll find a story they can't kill. In the final seconds before launch, the ship began to groan under its own failing pressure. The A screamed warnings, then sputtered into static. Elijah punched the release. The bay doors opened. The stars rushed in dot and with a burst of light. The shuttle tore free, sailing into the vacuum just as the reactor behind them exploded in a blossom of white fire, consuming the wreck, the probe, and the legacy of 1,000 lies in its flames. Inside the shuttle, Kethshil didn't speak. For a long time. He only watched Elijah, who sat breathing hard, the corners of his eyes wet with something more than relief. You didn't leave me, Elijah said finally. No, Kethshil replied, voice low and firm. Because you didn't leave me. First, they drifted in silence through the void, 2 fugitives, 2 survivors, hunted, yes. But whole, asterisk, the stars had changed since they left the wreckage behind. Not literally space remained what it always had been, cold and endless, but something in how Kethshil saw them was altered. They no longer looked like pinpricks of judgment or indifferent watchers. They looked like beacons. Distant, yes, but reachable. The shuttle drifted silently through the edge of Terran-protected territory, its stealth systems humming at minimum power, its rations low, oxygen carefully rationed, but its passengers awake and breathing. Elijah's condition had worsened. The radiation sickness, long embedded in his marrow like a parasite of memory, was beginning to unspool his strength. Each day, he spoke less, moved slower, but he never complained. That was the part Kethshil couldn't understand even now. Elijah never cursed the war, never asked why this was his fate. He only worried about the black box they had ejected before launch, now drifting on its own course toward neutral space. If someone finds it, he had whispered on the 3rd day, if someone listens, then this wasn't wasted. Kethshil sat by his side more often now. He no longer called Elijah by species, no longer thought of him as Terran. He had begun calling him brother not in translation, but in Varlan speak, the intimate tongue reserved for kin bonded by blood or life debt. Elijah had smiled at that, though his body had begun to betray him. Still, he worked when he could. Recorded messages. Drew star maps for Kethshil to use if he had to go on alone. You'll find others, he had said one night cycle, his voice barely a rasp. Others who are like you. Others who want peace but don't know how to say it out loud yet. And Kethshil had nodded, but silently promised himself he would find a cure before he found a cause. He wouldn't let Elijah die, not like this. Not after what they built, but on the 5th day. The Terran Union ship found them. It emerged from subspace like a ghost of steel. Its beacon coded and encrypted, but the symbols were clear. Medical. Rescue, not military. Kethshil had been the one to send the low-band distress ping secretly when Elijah had been unconscious. He'd hesitated for hours, fearing they would board the shuttle and end his friend's life on sight. But it had been too late. Elijah was slipping too fast. And Kethshil had chosen mercy over fear, The docking clamps latched on with a soft hiss. The door opened to a woman in white armor, her eyes wide the moment she saw the creature kneeling. Beside the sick human, Kethshel raised no weapon. He placed his claws over Elijah's chest, protective and still. "He's dying," he said simply. "Save him." They didn't shoot him. They didn't drag him away. They only moved urgent, efficient, flooding the shuttle with medical bots and stretchers. Elijah was lifted with care. Kethshel stood, unsure of his place now, unsure if he'd be shackled or thanked. But the officer, her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Elijah Roan. He's alive. Command will want to see this." Then her eyes met Kethshel's. "And you?" "I'm the reason he's still breathing," Kethshel said. "And he's the reason I ever wanted to." That was the last moment. They shared aboard the shuttle. Elijah, unconscious but breathing, was carried into the Terran vessel. Kethshel followed under heavy guard, not a prisoner, not quite a guest. The debates would rage for weeks across war councils and news feeds. And encrypted channels. Why had a Varlan saved a Terran? Why had the Terran saved him? What did it mean for peace? But none of that mattered when Elijah finally woke in a sterile medbay days later, coughing but alive. Kethshel had been sitting by his side the whole time, wrapped in quarantine barriers, surrounded by guards. He stood the moment Elijah opened his eyes, trembling with something deeper than relief. Elijah blinked, then smiled. "You stayed," he whispered. "Always," Kethshel replied. Their story became legend. It spread not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. One Terran soldier who could have hated, but chose compassion. One alien officer who could have obeyed, but chose truth. Together, they had not ended a war, but they had given the galaxy a new narrative. One where enemies became brothers. One where mercy was more terrifying than missiles. Years passed. The war cooled. Talks began. New alliances were forged not between governments, but between people, scientists, pilots, civilians, a fragile but growing thread of connection. Across species. Elijah Roan never returned to combat. His illness remained, tempered but never cured. But he spoke often to classrooms and councils about the day he saw a Varlan weep, and the moment he realized that mercy required more courage than war ever did. Kethshel, now a cultural envoy to the Terran Union, stood beside him often, glowing with calm light, always translating when Elijah's words faltered, and when Elijah finally passed older than expected. His breath shallow, but his heart full, it was Kethshel who held his hand. "You showed me the shape of humanity," the alien whispered, voice shaking with sacred grief. "And it is not war. It is not power. It is this." He pressed a data crystal into Elijah's still palm, his memory, encoded in scent and light. Then he walked outside, into a new Earth dawn, beneath a sky his people had once threatened, and smiled.